Hello and welcome back for another Geography Lab. This time we're working through Lab 8, which is entitled Earthquakes and Faults. So again, the purpose of this video is to take you page by page, set you up with the instructions, kind of things that'll help you do well, and pinpoint some of the areas that you might have some challenges, especially in this lab in particular, because we're going to learn how to triangulate the epicenter of an earthquake by utilizing the difference in speed waves between different types of earthquake waves, whether they be surface waves and things like that. But anyway, welcome to Lab 8, and let's begin. Alright, so earthquake and faults. So an earthquake is what happens when two blocks of the earth suddenly slip past one another. The surface where they slip is called a fault, or a fault plane. The location below the earth's surface is where the earthquake starts, and it's called the hypocenter. And the location directly above it on the surface where we feel that, we identify as being the epicenter. So as you work through this lab, the main thing I want to point out first is this little image right here, which is the Richter scale. So Charles Richter at Caltech tried to create a system in which we could understand the magnitude of an earthquake. There's a tremendous amount of energy involved in creating an earthquake itself, but how do we understand its size or its magnitude? So this is a diagram that kind of explains that a little bit, showing that here we get to a 2 or 3.0 earthquake is considered minor. But then as we move forward, each number that is given above that, like as an example, going from a 2 to a 3, it's a logarithmic pattern of 10 as it explains in the reading itself. So it's a 3 is 10 times greater than a 2. Well, then a 4 is 10 times greater energy than a 3. But it's 100 times greater than a 2 or 1,000 times greater than a 1. So that's why when we start looking at earthquakes in our landscape, and we start looking at 2, you kind of feel it. A 3, you start seeing some things moving. 4 becomes a little bit more serious. It's considered a minor earthquake. And then we kind of, as we move from each number to the next, it's really tenfold, literally, in its size, and it can be quite devastating in that sense. So the Richter scale in particular was created for that. There have been some other renditions more recently looking at the moment magnitude scale. There's other ways that we can start looking also aside from the magnitude as well as the intensity, and looking specifically at what type of devastation are we looking at? Are we looking at loss of life, loss of structures, and things like that? So let's move into what causes earthquakes and where do they occur. So the Earth has 4 major layers: the inner core, outer core, mantle, and crust. The crust and the top part of the mantle make up the skin of the surface of our planet. But this skin is not all in one piece. In fact, it's in pieces. So I explained in one of my lecture videos that it's kind of, I think about it similarly to like a large pool, and you have all those rafts, those crusts that are floating on that pool, and the jets that are underneath the water are able to push those rafts that those kids and you are floating on, and sometimes those rafts will bump into one another, sometimes they'll bounce apart, and that's really the idea of plate tectonics. But those plate tectonics help fuel the energy of our earthquakes. Yes, earthquakes happen along our boundaries, absolutely. But when we're looking more at what we're talking about here is, well, what happens in the center of the U.S., so the North American continent, which is an entire boundary itself. So why do we have earthquakes in places like Kansas or somewhere where you would not expect an earthquake to occur? And that's because of stress and pressure. So I'm going to use our copy of our lab as an example. If this were to represent an entire plate, if one side is pushing from the other, on this side, and then the other side's pushing as well, when they're pushing together, at some point it cracks. It cracks, and there is a release of energy along those areas or lines of weaknesses. And we will have weaknesses and fractures in rocks, and so they become susceptible to that release of energy. And so then we have these faults or these areas of weakness within our bigger plates. Another way to envision that is like an old dinner plate, like a really old dinner plate, and you'll see that it has all the little cracks and fissures that are within it. Those cracks are areas of weakness within that ceramic. Well, our plates have the same thing. So yeah, we have big boundaries that are being pushed and thrust, and they're pulling apart or whatever they're doing. But all that stress is also building up in these areas of weaknesses. So kind of bring it more locally to us, looking at the San Andreas Fault. That is an iconic transform boundary. So it's not just moving side to side, it's also pushing together. So, and it's not a smooth surface. So, looking at an index card, if I just kind of tear it like this, if the index card was smooth, nice, it slides. But that's not what's happening with the San Andreas. The San Andreas has areas and ridges in which that it's not. And so it gets stuck. And when it gets stuck, it builds up that stress, and at some point, pops. That release, that pop, is an earthquake. So we can look at that energy and magnitude. So I'm going to kind of move forward because be sure you work through this. Looking at the next page, it says, well, how do we locate, where this earthquake is occurring? That energy is being stored throughout that surface and deep beneath, and it's being fueled by that stress and tension that's being built up. At some point, it releases. So how do we find it? Well, because of these quakes, there's lots of motion that occurs. So as we see in the lab, that we have seismic waves, we have S waves, we have P waves, and we have surface waves. They all work differently. As you read through this text, you will see that they also travel at different rates. We will also learn that they cannot all travel through the same type of solids. So some waves can travel through everything. Some cannot. Some cannot travel through liquid. Some cannot travel through plasma. And they all move at different rates. So why is that important? Well, going back to how do we identify the location of maybe where is this origin of a quake, we can look at how these waves work on our surface. So as an example, we can see that an S wave moves up and down. A P waves crash, compressional, boom, 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 this way. So we've got two different waves. They arrive at different times and they arrive at different speeds. We also have surface waves, which is kind of like a little bit of everything all at once. You will receive in a location all three, maybe one, maybe two. It depends on how far away you are from the epicenter. It also depends on what type of surface we're dealing with. So if you've got a lot of plasma, certain waves will not be able to transfer through that surface in particular. So when looking at this, we can see as an example, primary waves move about 6 kilometers a second. S waves move about 3 kilometers a second. And then L waves, known as surface waves, move about 2.5 to 3 kilometers per second. With these rates, what ends up happening is that we can have a station, an earthquake station, and we will say, hey, you know what, we're starting to receive a certain wave. Maybe it's an S wave. And then the little needle moves. You've probably seen those in the movies before. And then some time may pass, and as that time passes, we may receive a second wave, maybe an L wave, from that same quake. Well, we can calculate the distance in the arrival times of those two waves to solve the distance, the physical distance between you and where that earthquake occurred. So that's pretty cool. So as you kind of work through this lab, it explains that process and how we do it. So be sure that you're reading all of that fine print. But I want to give you an example of how this is done because it is challenging and I understand that. So I'm going to use page 2 as an example. It says, so let's assume that you're working at a seismic recording station and you're at Golden, Colorado. At 1:45 p.m., you receive your first wave, which is an S wave, from a quake at an unknown location. So your little device starts jiggling, and you go, oh, okay, we're getting a quake, and we're getting an S wave. And then about 10 minutes later, an L wave arrives, a surface wave, about 1:55 p.m. So there were 10 minutes in between those two waves. Again, kind of backtrack, sorry. They do operate differently. Some are this way, and some are a mix. Think about doing a cannonball in a pool. When you do that cannonball in a pool, you have some of the water that's been displaced because of your mass going into that water, so that energy of that water is being dispersed. You also are going to have some ripples that go within that, and they all travel at different speeds. Similar idea. I'm trying to relate it. So it says here, perfect. So we know that we received two waves, an S wave and an L wave, and there was 10 minutes between them in which they arrived. So this sample down here plots it out for you. I'm just going to do it on this screen here so you can see a little bit better. So I've got my index card. So the first thing I do is I put my index card or a piece of paper or whatever you've got onto, I'm going to get my little pen right here. Let's make it a little bit thicker. There we go. The first thing is to solve how many minutes. And so we solved that in this is not part of the actual lab. This is the sample. We saw that it was going to, that's the highlighter. Sorry. There we go. It was 10 minutes. Perfect. So my first step is to find out what does 10 minutes look like. So 10 minutes looking at 0 is about this tall. Would you agree? So this represents 10 minutes of time on this graph. So I take my pen and I mark 10 minutes on my index card, the same way I just did in the lab. I'm using my monitor because it's just easier for me to show you. So that means this distance on my paper from the bottom to the top is the same as this distance right here. I can't bring it over to you if I could. That's 10 minutes. Perfect. That's the first step. The next step is to look at what waves we received. We received S and L. So that means we move this over to where S and L perfectly touch both. Where does that touch both? Overlap. Right about there. That is where this blue line of 10 minutes perfectly overlaps between the S and the L wave. So I take my little paper, I mark it there, perfect. Then it says in the instructions to then draw a line going straight down. So I'll do that going this way. Excuse me. We'll draw a line like this on top. And we see that, almost, hold on. That wasn't a very good line. It's hard to do on a computer, I know. So that's about where it goes. So it goes about straight down. So you can see now that this orange line is intersecting at just about 2,700 kilometers. So that means I have to get my piece of paper again and I mark out 2,700 kilometers of distance. So I'm going to mark on my paper this distance from here to there. So I get my paper and blah, blah, blah. I mark it right here. So this is 2,700 kilometers for myself, from the end of the paper to this little mark right here. That lines up perfectly and aligns with this one right here. This is the same distance. So that's perfect. So why is that perfect? Well, because then you would move on to your next page. Sorry, excuse all these things that are here, because we're not going to need all of these other ones. I'll just move those out of the way. Maybe. Maybe not. We'll see. Oh, what happened there? That doesn't matter. You get the point. So let's just assume that this was station A. That means the earthquake happened that far away from me. Yay! But we don't know. That's the issue. We can solve how far away the epicenter was from you. We just don't know the direction. So that means we would need to use this distance. And I'd use my little index card. And I would say, well, the earthquake happened this far away. Or it happened here, or it happened here, or it happened here, or and I keep doing this over and over and over again. So what I'm doing, again, is I'm aligning this point to where station A is, and then I'm marking in a circle so I can then, carefully, the best I can, connect the dots. So I create a circle around my epicenter. So that means the earthquake happened along this line. That is where the epicenter is, but I just don't know where. That's why I said it was called triangulation. So then what we need to then do is get the data from stations B and C. You'd create 3 different sets of circles, and at some point all 3 will intersect over the same point. That intersection will be the epicenter of your earthquake. So again, I'm going to clear this real quick, get to the mouse and just kind of recap. So again, what you're going to do is this was a sample. All that is explained right here. I explain it. You're going to use these data with these 3 different stations. They're all going to have different time sets. They're going to have different distances. Remember that step process. First, find out how much time and what does that time look like. Use a piece of paper. What does that measurement of time look like on this graph? Then, depending on the wave, S and L, P and S, you move it over to where does that time perfectly touch those 2 lines. Then you draw a line going straight down to intersect with the distance. Last step, you measure from 0 to that distance to see how far away the earthquake happened from you. Then you use that distance and you plot your little dots and then connect your dots to create a circle. And that will create, your line of saying, you know what, the earthquake happened this far away from me in one of these directions, and you got to call station B. Hey, did you receive some data? Yeah, we got the P in an L wave. It happened 21 minutes, and we know it happened along this circle. Do our circles intersect? Yes. Oh, cool. Let's call someone else and do the same thing. You connect those three pieces. So that then wraps up this portion of the lab. The next one's going to require us to create a model. So let's get model making. All right, welcome back to our last part of our lab. So again, remember, this lab really does well once you watch those lectures, and I've shared those lectures as well in your Canvas module. So we've learned briefly about the different types of waves and how we can use and how they move and the speed. And there was a lot more context within the lab, so make sure you do read all that. But now we want to look at how, beyond the faults themselves, what do those boundaries actually look like? And there's many different types of ways that they can work. In fact, there's activities where we can create over 7. We're going to look specifically at 3 different types of faults, or that boundary line. So where that earthquake is coming from, what does it look like on the surface and subsurface? So we're going to be looking at normal faults, reverse faults, and strike, slip, transform boundary faults. So you will cut out this lab. You'll cut this page. This is your model. You'll cut it out. These little gray tabs, those are your glue tabs. So you'll cut the whole thing out and you'll fold along these lines right here. These are the ones you'll fold along. And then once you fold those, you're going to tuck these little gray parts in, these little guys right here, underneath here, to create a box. And then once you've created your box, you're going to then cut along this dotted line. So that way you've created 2 halves of this box. So I'm fancy. During the pandemic, I thought, oh, I don't want to make sourdough bread, so I'm going to buy a 3D printer. And I made one of these using my 3D printer. And so you're going to create a little box, 2 pieces that we can move like this. And notice how there's letters. I mean, there's a lot to observe. So once you've done creating your box, I mean, you can color it if you'd like to help you, that would work. We see we have 3 different rock layers X, Y, and Z. We can have all these little dots. These squares represent locations that we're going to be observing and interpreting on our lab. And then we can have the road and the river and the railroad tracks in case those will become questions in the activity. So once you've put your model together, we go back to the earlier part of the lab, right here, modeling the faults. A fault is a fracture along which the blocks of crust on either side have moved relative to one another. Strike, slip, normal, and reverse faults. These are the 3 that we'll be looking at today. Using the model found on the last page, you will create each one of these faults, and you will then observe, and describe what it is that you see. Please color and assemble, because it's easier to color it before you assemble it. So once you've created your model, like I have here, you will walk through the lab. So we're going to first do a normal fault. So it says often associated with extensional forces, that means pulling, these result in divergent boundaries. Okay, cool. So it says here first, locate letters A and B. So I'm looking at my model. I'll move it up to your screen so you can see it. Let's see what I do with one hand. There's letters A and B. And then it says move letter B, which is the side, move B only. So it's next to A. So this side has to go down. Observe the model. This is the cross view. And then draw this in this box. So I cannot do that. But I will just say, like, if I'm holding it like this, you'll want to create this, this picture down here to the best of your ability. Do your best, the best you can. Why? Because you don't want to have to remake your model for your final exam because you didn't do a very good job. So I'm trying the best I can. I'm not an artist, especially holding something at the same time. So you'll draw it, remember that this side went down. So once you've kind of completed that, you will and then draw your lines, draw your horizons, letters X, Y, Z. Then answer the following questions. Question 1, which way did letter B move to point A? Question 2, what happened to the layers X, Y, and Z? Did anything happen to them? Yes. Are the rock layers continuous? Are they still parallel or have they crossed? Again, remember, like in the lecture, maybe this is vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry. Now that they've moved, are they still parallel or did they mix? And then it moves down here lastly, what likely happened to the river? What about the road and the railroad? So then you'll need to look at your model again, going this way. Well, what happens? Does the road break? Does it move? Does it go up? Does it go down? Does the river create a waterfall? Does the river, get cut off and the water will crash and make into a lake? What happens? It's an idea of observation and interpretation. So you will do this for a normal fault. You will also do this again for a reverse fault, and you will wrap up looking at a transform fault boundary. So we'll look at those. That wraps up this lab. So the main things to walk away with. First, I'm going to kind of clear my screen and go back up to the top. Make sure you're reading through all this. Please review the lecture material provided. Make sure you understand how the Richter scale works. Make sure you understand if there's questions about the moment magnitude scale, that it's covered as well. Moving forward, how does it work? How does that stress and tension and pressure build up because the fact that our rocks are not smooth and those faults are not necessarily straight lines, that stress and tension builds up until finally it pops and releases that energy, or it pulls and pulls and pulls, and you've got different types of tension, you got different types of stress, shear stress, that's pulling. How does that work? How does that energy look, and how does it measure up looking at magnitude? Lastly, over here, oops, sorry, I got a little crazy with the mouse. What type of waves are there that are emitted from these epicenters, from these releases of energy? How do they work? How fast they move? What type of surfaces can they go through? What are the attributes of that? And again, a lot of this is found here next to you in the lab, and then you'll find a lot of it also in the supplemental lecture material as well. Know the speeds. You have to memorize it. That's right here. You can reference these numbers. They're right here. How do you calculate S, P, or L time between those two? How do we find out how many minutes that is? How far that distance would be because of that? So make sure you understand those steps as you work through this. Again, make sure that you have drawn all three of your circles, show your work, identify where they all intersect to identify where the epicenter is. Make sure you do your model, have some fun, do a little bit of coloring, because that, a little bit of coloring therapy goes a long way. And that pretty much wraps up Lab 8. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me an email. Put them down in the comments below if that helps too. Other than that, I will see you soon.